So for this week, we're gonna go over the single arm dumbbell row. Most people are pretty familiar with this movement, I would say, but a lot of people misperform it. So this is one of those movements I would say that it just is really, really commonly done wrong. So let's go ahead and break it down, figure out what the cues are, figure out what the common mistakes are, how to alleviate those. So we will start with just general movement pattern here. So single arm dumbbell row is a horizontal row. By that, I mean that we're pulling in a vector into our body, horizontal against our body. So force is coming in this way, vertical pull obviously would be that way. So whenever we're doing a horizontal row, most of the time, we're gonna be focused a lot on scapular retraction. So pulling our shoulder blades back as we perform the movement. So you can think about this doing any kind of seated row. You wanna think about pinching your shoulder blades behind you. Contrast that to a vertical pull where you're pulling down this way. You wanna think about driving your shoulder blades down and depressing them. So big difference here means that instead of getting a lot of really tight lat contractions, we're mostly gonna be focused on getting our mid back, lower traps, rhomboids, even a lot of rear delts in here. So I don't want people to think about single arm dumbbell rows as a lat movement. And when you think about this as a scapular retracting movement, because that's where you're gonna get the absolute most benefit from the movement or the most benefit from the exercise. And from there, you will get lat involvement, but it shouldn't really be the primary focus because that will actually move you towards performing the movement wrong, like what we'll see in a second. But whenever we're setting this up, I like to have my hand on a bench like this or on any kind of a stable surface so I can actually brace and I don't have to put all the load into my low back. So you want it to be something like this. Your hips should be square. So that's very important. How you go about getting those square hips is kind of up to you, whatever feels the most comfortable. Some people like staggered stances to open up a little bit more. Some people like offset stances where their front foot here is actually the same side as the arm that's rowing. That's totally fine as well. I'm just gonna demo this with my feet actually even, just to kind of, really hammer home that square hip thing. So here, my feet are even, my hips are square. Bring that dumbbell in. So it's also very important how you pick it up, but you'll notice that this is a little bit light for me, but should still lift with your legs so that you're not putting it all in your low back. But here, the important thing is how I'm actually rowing. So the important thing is that vector of the row. So as I row in, I'm pulling my shoulder back and I'm pulling my shoulder blade back as well. So you want to think about leading with your elbow, but you don't want to think about swinging. So that's another component that we'll get to in a second with the mistakes. So rowing, shoulder blade back, full stretch, shoulder blade protracted at the bottom, but also not rotating my torso, pulling in, and all the way back down. So now as we're going through the mistakes for the single arm dumbbell row, it's gonna be really important to think about positioning. So always think about positioning of the hips, of the torso, of the shoulders, of the spine, whenever we're doing any kind of, especially row, but also single arm row, because there's going to be opposing forces here. So the first thing we're gonna talk about is rotation. So rotation of the shoulders, of the trunk, or of the hips. We wanna minimize that as much as possible whenever we're performing the single arm row. The more rotation that we have, the more risk of injury. We just want to minimize that as much as possible. So already talking about keeping your hips square in the cues that we were just going over, but now we're gonna talk about how we actually keep our trunk, our spine safe while performing a heavy unilateral row. So remember, a big component here is shoulder blade retraction and then also full protraction to get that stretch at the bottom. A lot of people will turn that into a twisting. It's actually kind of what we want to avoid here. So as we're performing the movement, keeping it here is very important, but as soon as you turn it into this, you put yourself at a much greater risk of injury for herniating a disc or pulling, a QL muscle in your low back or an oblique or getting a hernia. There's a lot that can go wrong whenever you start twisting your torso under load. So it's much better to be cautious. Keep that range of motion actually isolated towards, again, that shoulder shoulder blade protraction, retraction, and then getting that movement through your shoulder rather than trying to rotate too much through your torso. So that's mistake number one. Mistake number two is actually going to be what we are doing with the arc of the dumbbell. So a lot of people will say, lead with your elbow. Lead with your elbow whenever you're performing a single arm row. I think I actually said that as a cue a second ago as well. Yes, that's a great, great cue for most people to think about, but it often leads to an overcompensation as well. Whenever we're thinking of leading with the elbow, you also have to remember to row. So it seems so simple, but lead with the elbow can quickly turn this into this. There's a big difference between this and this as far as what your muscles are experiencing and how they're able to actually perform. So the latter, whenever we're just kind of swinging, technically, yeah, you're leading with your elbow and you're avoiding that like bicep curly overcompensation of the row, which a lot of people will get when this kind of what that looks like is here, where they're very bunched up. So we want to live in between this and this. And a lot of people have some struggles with actually finding what that feels like. But again, always think about you want to row. At the end of the day, it's just a row. You're pulling against gravity. So no swing, no curl, pull against gravity. Always want to keep your forearm perpendicular to the floor. So last thing that we're going to go over here is actually going to be how to differentiate between the row like we were just doing it and a single arm row with your knee up on a bench. So people often do it that way. That's a totally fine variation for most people, but in my opinion, that actually leads you to being in some less than ideal positions for actually expressing the most power in a single arm dumbbell row. So whenever we are in this knee up position, what you'll see is you have to take a very wide stance with that off leg to maintain balance. And your torso is basically horizontal with the floor, parallel with the floor. So with this, you're already going to be very limited with your power output. And you'll see here as well, it kind of forces you into almost like a bicep-y curl type of motion, like what we were talking about we want to avoid. Because if you actually pull back, that dumbbell is gonna hit your thigh or your hip before you actually get into that proper pattern. So if I want to row as normal, I'm kind of jamming that into my thigh here because it's just in the way. This has to